It is Easter. It is a beautiful part of our year, and it's a date for us to celebrate. And I am that we can more and more be together during this times. I think we can all say that this has been an incredible year and a half. We've gone through so many different things, right? We went through so many different challenges and different uh, this past 2 years now almost. And I think that Easter is a beautiful moment for us to think about. Um, I think that Easter is a beautiful time for us to think about transformation. And as we celebrate Easter today and celebrate the crucifixion and the resurrection, more importantly, of Jesus Christ, perhaps the most incredible soul to have ever graced our planet, we cannot think about we cannot but think about the lessons that he left behind. And one of those key lessons for us is that of life after life, that we begin to think of transforming ourselves and understanding that that which we are in the physical sense is not who we truly are. That's just a fraction of what we are, and that we have lived before we had a physical body, and that we will live after we leave this physical body behind. And so Easter is a very special spot in my heart for that very reason, because it gets us to think a little bit of our place and if we are giving the world the attention that it really deserves, but more importantly, if we are giving ourselves the space and time about ourselves as immortal spirits, spirits who are here temporarily to learn things and to change and to grow. And so today, although it is Easter, and although we no doubt celebrate this incredible older brother of ours that sometimes I like to call JC, um, I think one of the best ways to celebrate his message of personal transformation is to see the impact he has left us, or he has had in our lives and in many different lives. And so, if that's okay with you, for the next couple of minutes, well, more than a couple of minutes because I get carried away and I talk a lot, but for the next 30 to 40 minutes, a little bit more, maybe 45 minutes, I wanted to share with you my thoughts about Paul and his transformation in the road to Damascus, because if we think about it, none of that would have been possible without the presence of the Christ. But what I find fascinating about it is that, and that's kind of the gift of the Christ, and I think this is a moment for us to reflect on that as well, is that in the story that we are going to talk about today, Christ is not the main person. He's not the main character. But none of it could have happened and could have unfolded without him. And I think that is very telling. And it's very beautiful in many different ways, because in our lives, we may find ourselves in that same situation where the Christ might not be at the forefront of everything that we do, but his presence, that the presence of our good spirits and the presence of our understanding of spirituality in general, it is the determining factor that help us see the world differently. And so, although we may not be thinking about him every second, every day, the teachings and the awareness that he brought to us and continues to bring to us over these past 2,000 years is the fundamental key that will unlock a new perspective. And in terms of new perspective, what I really wanted to do, if that's okay with you, is to talk about our road to Damascus, is to talk about this idea that somebody else 2,000 years ago listened to that message and transformed himself in such a way so as to change not only his life, but the life around for anybody that was around him as well. Now, with that in mind, I should be very forthcoming here too, and say that I have a little bit of a skin in the game here, because I should tell you first that that I wrote a book about what I'm about to talk. So I want to make sure you understand that this is not a pitch for the book. This is me sharing a story that led me to write a book because I loved it so much. And I'm happy to share too that the book just won a silver medal and at the Illumination Books Award. So I'm really excited that people are responding well to it. But what I'm most excited about, and as we talk about Easter, is that people, I think, are beginning to connect to this idea that's possible for us to talk about the Christ and his teachings without necessarily thinking that it's connected to organized religion, that you have to go to church, that you have to embrace a specific denomination. I think that the message of change and personal growth is one that's universal. And I love that very much. And I was really happy, for instance, to see this review by Kirkus Reviews, which is a famous place that does reviews for books. And it says that this book succeeds in the tricky feat of being intriguingly spiritual without being explicitly religious. And that's my goal. And that's my goal for us today, is for us to talk about an incredible journey, an incredible transformation from somebody who lived 2,000 years ago and who's inviting us to think about our personal change as well, in a way that does not necessarily have to be tied down to religious thinking. So I want us to dive a little bit deeper into the personal reasons and the personal thinking behind the story of Paul the Apostle and his transformation, and the beginning of his transformation, I should say, as he moved from Jerusalem to Damascus. Does that make sense? Does that work with you guys? All right, so if that's the case, then what I do want to do over here is to share a little bit about Paul, because we are going to talk about the lessons that we can take away from his transformation, the 7 lessons that I take away from his experiences. But I want to lay the context a little bit for us to understand who was Paul, right? So sometimes we know Paul the Apostle, and we don't really fully understand the depth of his influence in the world today. So if we take a quick second here just to look at him, we see that Paul has been known as the apostle of the Gentiles, and that means that he was the person who was speaking to everybody who was not a Jew at that point in time. So everybody who's not a Jewish is a Gentile. And much of the reason why we have Christianity today the way we do is because of Paul. You might all remember from your Sunday schools or your studies or have you, that the New Testament, which is that other part of the Christian Bible, right? There's the Old Testament and there's a New Testament, that the New Testament is composed of 27 different books. And out of those 27 different books that come together, we know at least 4 of those, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so out of the remainder, 13 of them are letters attributed to Paul. And that's a big feat if you think about it, because 13 is almost half of 27. When you take the Acts of the Apostle, which is another book that's in there, you see that Paul's thinking, whether you agree that all the letters were really written by Paul or not, the influence of Paul in our Christian thinking is amazing. He's got at least half of the New Testament attributed to him. And in fact, we would not have had the New Testament if it weren't possibly for the teachings of Paul, because many of us might not know this, but the early writings that eventually became the New Testament were all found in Greek. And as you might know, the Jewish people at the time didn't necessarily speak Greek. So we are grateful that the message of the Christ left Jerusalem and the Jewish world to go outside to the Gentiles, because they wrote it down, and the earliest documents that we have actually came from them. So if it weren't for the apostle with the Gentiles going out into the world and sharing the history and the teachings of Christ, we might not have the New Testament as it is today. In fact, if we look a little bit more closer, we might be amazed by how much he actually walked and traveled through the world at that time. You see there on your screen, if I haven't put you to sleep just yet, lots of different arrows, and that's the many different journeys that he undertook at his time. And friends, he did that without a frequent flyer program, right? Without cars. This was on foot, horseback riding, and by boat. And he did that many times. And so he really did an incredible feats and incredible things. And to this day, his name is synonymous with great things, right? We have a St. Paul's Cathedral. We have cities named after him. And we often even use the term saint, right? To denote that he was truly somebody special. And I worry that sometimes all of this places him in our minds as if he was like a different kind of person, like he already started well to begin with, right? That he was cut from a different cloth. He was special. And that might have been the case, but we forget that before he was Paul, he was Saul. And I think that is a good lesson for all of us to think about as we think about the idea that we are going to go ahead and see a little bit about his journey in the road to Damascus and have a little bit of time to understand how we are going to benefit from his experiences, right? So, but before we begin, before we go there, I wanted to share with you a little bit about the reason why he is looking to go into the road to Damascus. Why is it that he's traveling? So that we can probably place it in context and understand where these lessons come from. And if that's okay with you guys, and I get your ear for a little longer, I'll try to be as fast as possible without getting carried away because I obviously love the topic. I want to leave time for us at the end so that we can really talk and comment and provide input to each other. And if you survive and if you're interested, I'll be glad to. I was talking to friends here, and they agreed that if you're up for it, we can do a drawing for a book at the end of the Zoom. But then you have to wait until the end. If you drop off before, so sorry. This is the one technique I have, people. One trick I have to try to make you last the whole day with me. So hopefully it works. All right, but let's talk about this for a second, right? Let's talk about his road and his journey to Damascus. If you look at this picture here, that is the road from Jerusalem to Damascus. That's roughly 150 miles away from Damascus, I should say, in modern-day Syria. It's about 150 miles away from Jerusalem, and it is a long journey. And so we ask ourselves, why would be Paul or Saul at the time be undertaking the journey? Well, Saul was a Jewish-born young man who, from an early age, showed incredible talent. He was smart. He was athletic. He was well learned. He had the ability to receive a good education from his parents. And even from an early age as well, he clearly displayed a desire and an inclination and a passion for the Word of God. And as a good Jewish boy, he quickly began more and more interested in the law of Moses and began to have, different roles within the state, because we have to remember that at that time in Jerusalem, in the Jewish world, there was really no distinction between the law and religion. Nowadays, we have a separation of state and church, and it seems awkward for us, but at that time, it was kind of one and the same. And so from an early age, we find Saul climbing through the realms of power and, more and more becoming more important. And he got to a point that at a really early age, like I was saying, he achieved the greatest, level that he could. He became a member of the Sanhedrin, which was the Jewish body of law. And he was a great orator. He was a great debater. And he was really passionate about the law of Moses. And it just so happened that at the same time, this new group of people were beginning to follow this little unknown prophet from Nazareth that had been crucified and killing. And surprisingly, to many of the Jewish authority at the time, more and more people were converting their way of thinking to follow this prophet called Jesus. And part of Saul's role then was to go and to apprehend these prophets and to try to prevent people from converting to this cult. And he was really good at that. He was a really smart man, and he was really passionate, and he went in many different ways. And if you really want to hear his entire story, I suggest a wonderful book that you might already have heard of called Paul and Stephen by the Spirit Emmanuel, psychographed by the medium Francis Xavier. And he will tell Paul's story much better than I could, to be completely honest with you. But what I can't tell you, though, is that we are going to focus just on one tiny passage of his life, because I think it's very symbolic. It has a lot of meaning for all of us. And that is his trip from Jerusalem to Damascus. And so what we ask ourselves is, why is he going to Damascus? And why is that so important? Well, he is leaving Jerusalem to go to Damascus because he has heard that in Damascus, there is this preacher who's also being very successful at leading people into Christianity. And this preacher is called Ananias. And Ananias is particularly interesting for him because Ananias was the same person that convinced the love of his life, Abigail, or that talked to Abigail about the Christ and his teachings, and led Abigail eventually to convert to Christianity before she passed away at an early age. So here we find Saul, a young, successful man, who, for many different reasons, broke his commitment to Abigail, only to go back to her later. And when he found her, she was already sick and dying. So here's a man who couldn't really fulfill his love, his desire to be together with his love. And when he finally gets to be with her, she has converted to Christianity, and then eventually she passes away. And his heart is broken. And I wonder if a lot of his rage and frustration was then not only placed on on life in general, but also on Ananias, because he lost Abigail, and before she passed, she also told him that she herself had converted to Christianity. Two blows on his heart, his proud heart at once. And so he sets out to find Ananias in Damascus. He goes back to his job, right? And he asks for permission to go to Damascus to find Ananias. He commissions 3 other people and helpers and horses and food, because as you might remember, as we look here in our road, this is not exactly the kindest of roads. And there were no Motel 6, no 7-Elevens along the way, and no drive-thrus, no credit cards, no hotels. Right? This is a pretty interesting road you're going to embark on. If it's 150 miles, it's going to take you maybe like 7 days or more to get there if you're walking 20 miles a day. And you're going to have to sleep at night somewhere, and you don't know where you're going to sleep because, again, there are really no hotels along the way. And so you have to carry provisions with you because you don't know where you get your food to. And if you're important, like Saul was, you take a posse with you, right? Because it's also unsafe for you to travel. So here he is traveling on the road to Damascus. And what's fascinating about this whole piece, if I may add it, I might say so, is that when he is almost at Damascus, something out of the norm, something incredible happens to him that changes his life forever. As they are nearing Damascus, a light presents itself to him. And it's such a bright and shining light, according to the Acts of the Apostle, one of those books of the New Testament, where we find the story in greater detail. The light was so incredibly shining and different that forces Saul to fall off his horse, basically. And he falls into the ground and he feels the presence. And he asks what that is. And the presence that he feels answers as Jesus. And all of a sudden, there he is, Saul, in the dusty road, somewhere on the way to Damascus, hurting because he just fell off his horse, confused, not understanding what's happening. And he finds the presence of that dead prophet of Nazareth, Jesus Christ, to which he was persecuting. And he realizes, it must have been an incredible moment, right? And he realizes at that point in time that everything that he has done up to that moment no longer suits him. That everything that he has done in terms of his work, his life, remember, he's a workaholic who's going on a business trip, so to speak, right? And he realizes that the job that he had is not what he thought it was. And that voice that talks to him asks him perhaps one of the most fantastic questions we can hear. It says, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And Saul, then taken by that question, that moment, which we can only imagine how it might have felt, asks another wonderful question. It says, Lord, what would you have me do? In that moment, he realizes everything has to change, and he asks Jesus for help. He gets an answer that's a fascinating answer too. Jesus tells him to go to Damascus and wait. He doesn't get all his answers, but he gets that answer. When he comes back to himself, after that moment is gone, he finds himself on the road hurting with his friends around him, wondering what must have happened. And here's the kicker, friends. He's blind. He can no longer see. He tells his friends or his colleagues or co-workers, whatever you want to call it, that he's had his experience. He tells them that he heard and saw Jesus and that he needs to go to Damascus. And oh, by the way, I am blind, he says. And all these people around him, knowing that he's an important person, probably, I guess, thinking that he had too much sun, right? Because they've been on the road for a while. Maybe he didn't drink enough water. He falls off the horse with no reason, knocks his head, and now he starts talking about Christ, who he did not like at all. And he says he wants to continue to go to Damascus. And his friends are probably saying, no, no, no. Let's go back to Jerusalem. Let's take him back to the doctors. Let's go back, take him home, right? Because he's an important figure. They're probably thinking, what happens if he dies here? The people are going to blame me. So they're pushing him to go back, but he, stubborn as he is, he says he's going to go forward. So two of those friends go back to Jerusalem to make all the trip back to tell people what has happened. And one of them agrees to go forward with him to Damascus because they know that he is going to go. There's no stopping him. Eventually, they make their way to Damascus, and they knock on the doors of different people because, as you might remember, he was a famous politician at the time, basically. And anybody would have competed for the right to host him in their house. It would be a great honor. And he has had many acquaintances. But guess what happens? None of his so-called friends take him in. As he speaks to them about his experience that he has faced and how he's now transformed by this idea of the Christ, none of his old friends decide that they are going to take him in. It's political suicide for doing that. They don't want to have anything to do with this new Saul guy. So eventually he has to find an inn. And an inn at the time, friends, was nothing more than an extra room at the back of somebody's shop or maybe their home, right? Because there were no hotels. They find an inn on the main city street called Straight Street. And eventually they get there. And then eventually when they get there and find a little place, Saul releases his last helper, says, you can go back home now, because he starts to realize that, you know, his last helper that's still with him too is also beginning to get worried that people are going to think that he too is in on the Christ bandwagon. And that's dangerous. He doesn't want to do that. So Saul finds himself for a period of time that we don't know exactly what it is, but the Acts of the Apostle tell them that he spent 3 days without drink or water, just waiting for something to happen. And then something does happen. And guess who knocks at his door after a while? Ananias, the very person that he was persecuting, that he was going to enchain and imprison, knocks at his door because Ananias himself also had a vision of the Christ, who told him to go and help Saul, who would be at that particular place in that particular street. And if I can make a little parenthesis here really quick, can you imagine that, friends? Right? The conversation of Ananias and Christ, Christ saying, Ananias, go help Saul. And Ananias going, Lord, do you want me to go help that person who's been imprisoning and killing Christians? That's Saul? Is that the one that you want me to go into and find? The one that I've been avoiding? And, you know, kudos to Ananias for following the request of the Christ. And I think the rest of the story, you may know. Ananias goes see Paul, puts his hands as if giving him spiritual passes, and as if scales fell from Paul's eye, Paul is able to see again. And I think the rest we also know. In time, after much reflection, Paul starts to know different people in Damascus, starts to understand more about the teachings of the Christ, goes into the desert, meditates, comes back, and the rest of his life is dedicated to sharing with people the incredible teachings of the Christ, which we celebrate today on Easter, and especially being that of the existence of ourselves as immortal spirits. So I told you all that story because I really want us to look at his story and see if there's similarities to our lives. Now, we oftentimes think that desert there, right, that piece and that story, it really seems like almost like a fairy tale, right? And it's really not connected to us at all. But when we start to look at things slightly different, when we start to see Saul not as somebody who had lived 2,000 years ago and that it's completely disconnected to us, but instead as somebody who was really dedicated to his work and was a workaholic and worked really hard and tried his best and fell in love, made some decisions that were not great, lost that love, and when he finally went back, that person whom he loved passed away. And he's now putting all his energies in his job, is his work, to make up for all the hurt that he's feeling. And as he's traveling in this important business trip of his, he realizes halfway through it that the only thing he has left, which is his work, his sense of purpose, is perhaps not the best one. He thought he was helping people, and he realizes that his work was actually harming people in many different ways. And now he's faced with a choice. Should he change jobs? Should he leave his job behind, even though he doesn't have a new one lined up? Should he go to a different place? Should he move? What should he do? Should he pretend that nothing that happens and just continue to go ahead because of his paycheck? When we think that way, I think it makes things a little bit easier, a little bit closer to us. And then what I want to do is I want to take 7 different symbols, 7 items for reflection from his journey, so that we can apply to ours. And hopefully, especially during Easter, it will give us some fodder, some opportunity for reflection. So you guys with me so far? Does that make sense? All right, so here's where we really start. Here's when we really dive in, right? And again, we are not going to go into a lot of details. And if you want to go into full details of my thinking on this, of course, the book is there. But the first lesson that I think we take away from Saul is the fact that he was in a group, but he was alone. And why do I say that? Because there he was with 3 other people as he's made his way from Jerusalem to Damascus. But as we learn, only he was exposed to and had the encounter with the Christ. None of his friends around him heard the voice or really saw the light. And I think that's very telling and very beautiful in many different ways, because maybe we're not that different. And by that I mean that all of us are called to have a transformative experience in our lives. But that doesn't always happen at the same time to that of those around us. So we go through life in families, in groups. We have groups of, co-workers, of what have you. But the truth is that each one of us is called spiritually to change and do things differently at a different time. So one of the challenges that we face in our lives is that we are going to be called to pay attention to something important to change at the same time that those around us might not understand it. They might be going through life with us, but just like Saul's co-workers, they might not understand why is it that at that particular moment in time, we begin to think slightly different. We begin to want different things. And that is hard because we all want the acceptance of those groups around us. We all want to be loved, supported, and cared for. But it is also true that when the spiritual opportunity knocks at our door, we are the ones who have to answer it. And nobody can do our growth for us. And that feels lonely. Let's just call it out. That feels lonely because it feels like nobody understands what we're going through. They can't perhaps understand why you're choosing to change jobs or change cities or end a relationship or what have you, because they don't know what's really happening. Only you do. And that's because you are the one who have to make those decisions. And that's a powerful awareness that we have to begin to understand, because we want to be supported by others, but it is up to us to do our own growing and our own learning. And so if you find yourself in this moment in life where you feel that those people around you don't understand what you're going through, if you find that your family doesn't really know what's in your heart, you might sometimes feel alone, or perhaps you feel like you were abandoned and that nobody understands you. And that hurts. But instead, the opportunity of the moment as we look into Saul's journey to becoming Paul is that is the preamble, that is the beginning of change. So don't think of it as you being ostracized or pushed aside or being punished. Quite the opposite. Think of it as the beginning of some incredible transformation that might be ahead of you. Because at the end of the day, you are the person who has to make those choices and grow. If somebody else makes them for you, then it's not your decision. So you don't get really to reap the merit of the change. But if you're finding yourself, one more time, a little out of touch, a little lost, a little abandoned, and I think that the COVID has really kind of raised that feeling a little bit for all of us, right? When we've had more time to be by ourselves and our families or our home and not be able to see our families, it's a moment for digesting our lives, thinking about things, and seeing if really we want to change. So that's the first gift that Paul leaves with us. It's a sense that if you feel like people around they're not understanding what you're going through, don't think that you are being abandoned or you're going to be alone. Just understand that your beginning of a new phase in your life is starting, that you're beginning to transform yourselves. So we can talk a little bit more about that if it's unclear, but let's move on to the second part of our journey here as we move towards the Damascus. The second lesson that I think it's a beautiful one that Paul also gives us is that of a destabilizing meeting. And what do I say that for? Because we often think that spiritual growth is going to come through pleasant experiences. Sometimes we feel like we're going to become better people and the skies will open and a ray of sun will shine from above and angels will come down playing harp and singing, ah, and we've become spiritually elevated. But most of the time, friends, we are actually going to be met by a destabilizing meeting with life, where life will literally throw us off our horse so that we understand that we need to change something in ourselves. That's what happened to Saul. In his case, he was literally knocked off his horse. And that hurts. If you ever fell off a horse, and I have, it hurts, friends. And sometimes the most painful situations in our lives are the ones that really make us think about a different way of doing things, a different way of being. And so maybe you can look back in your life. Maybe you can find something that was really hard for you that happened that during that time when it happened, it was painful, but that today you were thankful and grateful that it happened because it set you in a different way, in a different path. And that is a beautiful awareness, one that we ought to bring to the forefront of our minds. Because every time that a challenge happens, it is indeed a subtle compliment to your ability to overcome it. Think with me here for a second. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that everybody who's in this call today, and who's not asleep, believes in God or in something greater. And if we do, then we must also begin to make peace with the fact that the challenges we have can and should be solvable. God will never give us a problem that we cannot solve. Because if God did that, it would be a mean God. We don't do that to our own children, right? So all the challenges that come our way, we can figure them out. Now, we might not figure them out the way we want to, but there is a solution to them. And in fact, the more we study about reincarnation and so forth, we know that we have come to this earth to solve challenges and to grow. So it's important for us to remember that the key moment in Saul's life wasn't one of pleasantry and joy, but it was one where he was literally pushed onto the ground so he could understand that he needed to do something different in his life. And so maybe we ought to ask ourselves too, are these difficult moments in our lives moments of great change? Should we start to see them not as punishment, but as an opportunity to refocus and shift? I mean, friends, the elephant in the room here is COVID. As a society, we've been worried about it, but if we think about it that way as well, we see that this is a time which we have been given to reflect of whether we want to continue to carry on as we were before or whether we want to make new changes. Because if we just want to go back to our lives the way they were before, maybe there's a missed opportunity here. We might talk a little bit about that later, but that's the second gift that I feel the example of Saul leaves us with. This idea and understanding that the challenges that present themselves to us, they are not punishment. They are an opportunity for growth, and that we should leverage. And if we continue to move ahead then, as we move up our road towards Damascus, the third lessons that I think that we can take away from Saul's encounter with the Christ is his courageous question. And why do I say that? Because, when faced with the opportunity to be front and center with the Christ, what was it that Saul asked the Christ? He asked, Lord, what would you have me do? Now, I don't know about you, but if I were the one in his shoes, and I've been doing things that perhaps weren't the best ones as he was doing before, if Christ showed himself up to me and literally knocked me off my horse, I think the first couple of things that I would say was, I am so sorry. I didn't know it was you. I didn't know better. Apologies. I thought I was doing it right. I would start to justify myself, right? I would start to defend myself. But none of that happened. None of that happened with Saul. He was quick enough to realize that the best way for him to make up for the challenges for the choices he made in the past was to make better ones in the future. So he also recognized at that moment that he doesn't know what to do. And for a powerful man such as himself, that's quite a change, right? And for us, perhaps doesn't need to be that big of a change or as hard, but it's also possible. We may also have to grapple with the idea that maybe we need to do things different and we may not know how to. And it is okay for us to ask that courageous questions. What should I do? And Lord, how can I do it? Help me figure that out. It's a moment of reckoning, so to speak, when we come with terms with ourselves and understand that we do not have all the answers to life, but we can get help. And a suggestion that stays here with us today is that maybe one potent way of getting help is connecting with our spiritual mentors and guides and with Christ and asking for that guidance. And knowing that there's much for us to figure it out. And come to terms with the idea that it's okay for us not to know what we really need to do all the time. It's a big fallacy in our world, right, where everybody pretends they have it all figured out, where they all know where they're going. They all know what they're going to do. And it almost feels like we should too. But if you, like Saul, are somewhat in the road to Damascus, and you don't know where you're going just yet, you are not alone. It's okay to ask for help. It's okay to think about it that way. Before I babble too long, let's move on to number 4 and see what else Paul can teach us on the way to Damascus. The fourth beautiful symbolism I find in his story that might have to do with ours is that Paul experienced temporary blindness after his encounter with the Christ. And that is very beautiful, because sometimes when we are exposed to the light, to more beautiful and higher knowledge, it affects us in such a way, knocks it off our horse, right? That we begin to question everything that was before. We don't know what's up or down anymore when we begin to understand this new reality. When we are first exposed, for instance, to the idea of reincarnation and life after life, we begin to question the way we live. We begin to ponder whether our priorities were the same. It is as if we have become spiritually blind, so to say, where we don't know how things work anymore. We can really see our way forward because everything that we had believed until then changed when we began to realize that we are immortal spirits. Because if we are immortal spirits and we will outlive this physical body, And there is such a thing as cause and consequence when it comes to our actions and our choices. Then maybe I shouldn't do everything I wanted just to get ahead here and now. Maybe I shouldn't step on you to get what I want right now, because guess what? I am going to be responsible for those consequences. And so maybe having a beautiful home, a beautiful car, the best job, and a lot of power, maybe that's not what I want anymore. And that's very confusing. So we don't know where we are. We're blind to the world, so to speak. But if you're there, if you find yourself dazed and confused by the world because you're beginning to see that you are changing and that your values no longer fit or match that of society and people around you, which happens to be very lonely, don't think that you are alone. Just think that you are transforming yourself. You are with Saul in that moment when he is learning to see the world again through different eyes, through the eyes of the Spirit, through the eyes of the teachings of the Christ, which is a beautiful moment for us to talk about that, because Easter is a reflection of exactly that, of the apex of the Christ message to us, right? When he resurrects, showing us, doing something that nobody really had done before, come back to life after dying. So if there's one beautiful message I take away from the life of the Christ, is that he showed us through evidence that life goes on after the death of the physical body. Nobody in history had done it until then. Nobody has done it ever since. So our temporary blindness, our confusion that we experience as we begin to grapple with our spiritual selves and want different things, is a normal step in our process. So if you find yourself grappling with those thoughts, unsure or how to lead your old life, now that you have this new knowledge that you are an immortal spirit who reincarnates as many times as needed to grow, and that the things of the physical world are not as important as the things of the spirit, then you're not alone. Then Paul's blindness has got to you as well. So I find it useful for us to think about that context, because then we know that we are on a path. We are on a road somewhere else. We're not just suffering the moments in our lives. We are going and walking towards something. And talking about walking, let's go ahead and move on a little bit as well to the fifth symbolic moment in Saul's life that I think pertains to all of our lives too. The decision to go ahead. After Saul has the encounter with the Christ and comes back to his senses and realizes that he is blind, his friends all want him to go back to Jerusalem. But he has a choice to make. Should he go back to Jerusalem, or should he move on to Damascus? Should he go back to everything that he has known before, the life he's known before, the friends he's had, the job that he held, the comforts that he experienced? Or should he continue to walk forward? Even if he's blind and he does not know where he's going or what's going to happen, should he go on to Damascus and find out what lies ahead for him? That's a really beautiful and hard question that all of us must come to terms and make a decision on at some point in our lives, or maybe many points in our lives, when we have to decide if we go back to Jerusalem, which is symbol for everything that we've been before and the way we lived our lives, or if we are going to change and say, I am going to move forward even though I don't know what lies ahead. We often think or want to get to something new before we can let go of the old. But the truth is that life often asks us to make space for the new by getting rid of the old. We have to clean ourselves, so to speak, our minds, and make space in our lives for the new opportunities by letting go of the old ones. And that's a very scary process. Because if we don't, then we can never move ahead. We can, end up being trapped. We can end up being trapped in that moment in time and not make a decision either. but the decision to go ahead is an important one. Will we then make it? Will we choose to move ahead to Damascus, to the new, or should we go back to where it was before? And it's very important for us to think about that as we think about the world nowadays, because we are collectively facing with that very question, right? With COVID, I hear many people saying, I'm dying to go back to how things were before. But then I ask myself, was really the world that great 2 years ago that we all want to go back to that, right? I hear the clamoring of let's go back to Jerusalem. But I think that this is a moment where we have to make a decision to go forward to Damascus because it wasn't working for everybody else. But anyways, I digress, right? And so as we move around and think about different things and go back to our trip here, into Damascus, it's important for us to think about that. And I think that the next piece that I want to talk to you about is 6, the unexpected help. And here's good news for us, people. This is the moment in our journey where we begin to notice that things are turning around. Until now, we had a lot of individual challenges, right, to face. We had a lot of internal work to deal with. We were moving around, rethinking ourselves, trying to figure out what was really happening and all that good stuff. But the unexpected help brings us good news. And what's the good news here? The good news is that we always have unexpected help along the way. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that just like Saul had a chance to be helped by Ananias, so too will we. Because if you think about it, for Ananias to be able to find Saul in that dirty, unkept room in the street called Straight, it was only so because the Christ told Ananias where to find Saul. And the Christ could only tell Ananias where to find Saul if the Christ was following Saul's journey all along. And we all are just like that. We all receive the benefit of help. We all receive the benefit of assistance when we're least expecting. Because the good spirits are always helping us move forward. They are always helping us move along. And here's a powerful thing, friends. Here's a kicker. Who was it that helped Saul? Ananias, the very thing that he was persecuting. Isn't that ironic? That sometimes the thing that we avoid the most or that we dislike the most are the ones who are actually going to help us the most. And so sometimes I ask myself, who is my Ananias? Who is that thing that I have been avoiding, afraid of, but will help me grow? Because that might be the thing that really does. Isn't that ironic that help also comes when we need it the most? Because if you think about it, friends, if Ananias had arrived and found Paul before he even get to Damascus, I don't know if Paul would have listened. I think maybe Paul needed to stew a little bit on that moment, being blind and lost and forgot, to really open himself to the change ahead. So the unexpected help is always there. Can we recognize it? Can we understand what that is? That's one of the legacies of Saul for us. And the last one, and I'm sure that you're going to cheer after this because I've been talking for a while, so you might need a break of my voice. But the 7th lesson that Saul leaves with us is that of a different Damascus. I think we can all agree that the Damascus that Saul arrived at felt very different than the Damascus he thought he was going to arrive at. Right? Life changed, circumstances changed. It was still the same city, but it was fundamentally different for him. And so I ask myself, What is our Damascus? Because sometimes our goals in life change when we get them. Sometimes we think that happiness will be an incredible job, that relationship, that house, that standard of living, and then we get that. And we know that that does not make us happy. I mean, we are full of examples, aren't we, of people who are rich, beautiful, and famous, and who are not happy with their lives. So, those stories that we told ourselves of what would make us happy need to be reevaluated every once in a while. We need to rethink what is our goal, what is our destination, what is our Damascus. And it's okay too to change that as we walk to the end goal. It is okay for us to, along the way, decide that we don't longer want to go to that Damascus, that we want to go to a different one. But the important thing here is for us to really think, what is our end goal? What is it that we want to do? What is our Damascus? Personal, of course, question, but nevertheless, a decision that needs to be ruminated and thought about, because I just had a realization a while back, friends, that most of us may spend more time brushing our teeth than thinking of ourselves as more immortal beings. Because brushing our teeth, all of us at least do twice a day, right, for a couple of minutes. But I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure. I'm going to trust that all of you guys are brushing your teeth, by the way. See what I did there? I just assumed that all of you guys are brushing your teeth. And if you're going to smile, smile with your mouth closed now so we don't judge you, so we don't see your teeth, unless you have beautiful teeth. But anyways, I digress. My point is here, we spend more time sometimes doing that than praying, than reflecting of who we truly are. And that's telling. And I'm not pointing fingers here, friends. I am saying that because sometimes I go a whole day without thinking about myself as the immortal spirit, right? Or more. And we ought to start thinking about that and changing our perspective on all of this. And so this is an interesting moment for us to begin to consider all of these things and along this journey. And I think that that's the beauty of Saul's journey and the symbolism that we can find. I picked 7 items, but there's so many more in this beautiful journey. There's so many more that he has left with us. But just to think about briefly, Saul's journey to Damascus is somewhat similar to our lives, because through it we learn that even though we walk together in groups of people, at the end of the day, we are the ones who are going to have to make decisions by ourselves. That may feel lonely at first, but when we understand that growing is making those decisions and opting to go a certain way, then we understand that we are not going to be alone forever. It just feels in that moment in time. And we also understand that challenges and tribulations are generally the ones that are going to elicit growth in us. They're going to help us grow. And so those destabilizing meetings with challenges and troubles in our lives, there are blessings in disguise, meant to redirect us to something greater, something more beautiful. And along those lines, when we are faced with challenges, may we also have the ability to ask courageous questions, to really ask ourselves, so what is it that we want to do? And we might have to understand the confusion that comes from all of this is normal. The blindness that presents itself to us in life as we are struggling with change and we want to find our purpose and meaning is natural. The confusion is a sign that you're relearning how to do things. So you're creating a new framework in your mind of new values and new things that you need to go. But nevertheless, all of us get to a point where we need to make a decision if we are going to go ahead and try this new path before us to something that we want to do, our Damascus. Or whether we are going to say, not right now. I'm not going to go back to Jerusalem. I'm going to wait until I retire. I'm going to wait until I have more money. I'm going to wait until, I don't know, I'm older. The choice of going back to what we were or moving forward is ours. And when we make that choice to go ahead, the good news is that we always get help. We get the Ananias of our lives who come and help us in one way or another. And in the process of moving forward, we are going to be led to think about what truly matters to us and reinvent our Damascus. And I think as we take stock of Easter specifically, and of all the blessings and the wonderful knowledge that Spiritism has given us, I'm reminded of this wonderful quote from the Gospel of John, in which the evangelist says that Jesus told us, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, even though they die, will live. And whoever lives by believing in me shall never die." Do you believe this? I read it in this particular way, friends. Knowing that Christ had no ego whatsoever, which is very different than us, he's really saying, my teachings and the teachings that I have brought to you are the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in these teachings and understands the immortality of the spirit, even though they lose their physical body, they will continue to live. And whoever understands this while we're here on earth will never die, because they will understand that their life will continue in the spiritual realm. And as a good educator that Jesus was, he asks us to make a decision. Do you believe this? And as we sit here on Easter, friends, as we sit at the time where we are celebrating the resurrection of the Christ, let us take a moment to think about the implications of his example in our lives. Of course, we want to celebrate that. But what he really came to do was to elicit change in our lives. Much the same way that he helped Paul change, he's also on the sidelines, waiting for us to undergo our own journey and answer the call to go to our Damascus, whatever it may be. So I think that this is a prime moment for us to think about what is it that we are going through, how are we changing, and where do we want to go. And I hope the more and more all of us can find a way to happiness, to our Damascus, faster and more beautifully than we would otherwise have. And no doubt, our older brother Jesus would always be with me. So that's kind of what I wanted to share with you. And then I wanted to see if we still have time to open up and just take your comments and take your insights. If you want to dive deeper into any of those things, of course, the book is there for that matter. You can find me on social media as well. I love having that conversation. But clearly, I'm very biased about this example, this blueprint that Paul has left to us through the times, that was only made possible because Jesus interfered in his life, so to speak, and set him on a quest to be something more than he was before. Does that make sense?